that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time our greed has blinded us to the needs of others.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For the selfishness that sets us apart and alone.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For losing sight of our unity.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, we have fueled the illusion of separateness.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
I'll invite Karen Jansen to come up and introduce our speaker for today.
Brenna, I hope I say your last name right, Wallhauser. Brenna is, I'm so glad she's here with us today. Since I volunteer at hospice and have for quite a few years now, I've gotten to know her. She started as a volunteer in 1992 while a student at Berea College, and we love having students as volunteers there. We have the whole age range of volunteers. She loved it and wanted to come back after graduating, and there was an opening present, and she became the volunteer coordinator. Her family, and later a community outreach coordinator, and then her family moved, and then she returned in 2011 as Director of Public Relations, which she is now, and she also works on grants and other activities for hospice. But you know, those are the facts and the numbers. What's important to me is that she combines very nicely both being very professional and very kind and thoughtful, and provides a lot of guidance for other staff at hospice and the volunteers. So, and you still work closely with the volunteer coordinator as well. So, Brenna, it's yours.
Make sure I get all this on correctly. Okay, already I've done something wrong. Well, I'll start talking. If you can help me get my screen back, that would be wonderful. I don't know what I've done. It should be on. It may be that I started maybe it needs to escape out of the PowerPoint. just noticed it was unplugged, so that may be what happened. I'll try to turn it on and I'll talk while it's coming back on. Okay, it's going to fire up, so I'll start talking. First, I wanted to say thank you for inviting us. It's really an honor to be here. Oh, is that better? I'm not used to being anchored, so you're going to have to remind me a few times. I can take it off. That's great. Wanted to thank you all for inviting us here today and for your fellowship's decision to support hospice care. It's really important for us to have financial support, and I hope by the end of today you'll understand why that's the case, and why it's particularly important for our nonprofit hospice to have the financial support of the community. What I thought I would do today, and I'm going to count on Karen to give me a 5-minute heads up. I don't want to go over and take more of your time today, is first just kind of share the facts about hospice care and our hospice. Then, at Karen's suggestion, I did spend some time on your website reading about the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, and so some of those really seem to me to be particularly connected to the kind of work we do, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that connection. And then I brought a reading or two that I'm going to have you help me with. So think about I need 3 readers, and I'll bring you a piece of paper. You can read something for me, and those readings are going to help connect those principles with the work we do. Then I'll share if this ever gets up and going again, and it's going to. Here we are. This will get going. So then on here, I'll have these stories that something to help me share a story or two, because I think I can talk all day about hospice care and 7 principles, but stories are what get at us best and demonstrate how these things are connected. And then there will be time for questions if I have done all of this in the allotted time and Karen doesn't have to drag me to my chair. So we are Hospice Care Plus. We were founded here in Richmond in 1981 by really a group of women at EKU who were mostly in nursing or health sciences, who had gone to Hazard to hear Dame Cecily Saunders speak about this British movement called hospice care. And they were so impressed with what they heard that they came back determined to start their own hospice in Madison County. And so we really have those women to thank for this hospice's existence. We serve 6 counties now. We serve Estill, Jackson, Lee, Madison, Owsley, and Rockcastle counties. So that's our service area. We have 4 main programs. Our primary program and the foundation of our hospice is home care for hospice patients in those 6 counties. We also have hospice inpatient care at the Compassionate Care Center here in Richmond. We have a palliative care program, and we have grief and loss support. We're a nonprofit organization. Might interest you to know, very few people know this, Kentucky's the only state left in this country that has 0 for-profit hospices. I expect that'll change soon, and then our hospice will face a large for-profit hospice that spends 40% of its revenue on marketing. And that'll be a difficult day, but we are hoping that our community will remember that we've been here 35 plus years, and we're the ones who've been caring for you all that time. We are accredited by the Joint Commission, which is a voluntary process for hospices. It's required for hospitals, but we voluntarily started participating in that several years ago. And we provide care regardless of ability to pay. That's part of our mission. So regardless of someone's insurance status or whether they're able to afford care, we provide care. We have 3 locations, and people often say, oh, I know about, when they see us at the Berea office, they'll say, do you know about that great hospice in Richmond? So we're all connected. We're all the same. Hospice Care Plus has the Compassionate Care Center in Richmond. Our main office is in Berea, and that's where our home care team works out of, and our administrative staff. And then we have a tiny little office near the mini mall in Berea, and that is for our durable medical equipment. That's where we store, clean, and prepare for delivery, hospital beds, and those kinds of things. The basic hospice approach is, I'll give you 4, I could talk all day about hospice and what makes it unique, but I'll give you 4 main points. One is We feel very strongly that the patient and family together have to be the focus of our care, that this is more than just an experience for the patient we're caring for. This experience affects the entire family. We believe it takes a complete team, that caring for someone in the final months of life is about more than addressing physical symptoms, and therefore it takes more than a nurse and a doctor to provide that care. So every patient has a whole team, and that includes a nurse, a social worker, a nurse aide, a chaplain, volunteers, and possibly others. We are very much zeroed in on quality of life, and more specifically, quality of life as it's defined by the patient and family we're working with in that moment. And then the fourth, I think, main characteristic is bereavement care, that hospice thinks it's very important to not disappear after the death of the loved one, that the patient's family will continue to need some level of support, and our bereavement staff work with the caregiver and the family to determine what kind of support is appropriate and what level of support is necessary. And now I'm going to try to actually get this up here for you. And the last thing I'll do in this little facts section is go over a few of the most common myths or misconceptions about hospice care and address those really quickly. One is that hospice care is for the last weeks, hours, or days of life. There we go. So we're all the way over here. The fact is that hospice was designed to work and have at least several months to work. If you want to be specific, the physician has to write an order saying that if this disease follows its normal course, the life expectancy is projected to be 6 months or less. That doesn't mean that we can only care for someone for 6 months. It just means that we have to continue to demonstrate to Medicare or Medicaid that decline continues. If a patient improves, which has happened with my family member recently, they can actually be discharged from hospice care. The other thing I want to say about that myth is that studies actually show that people who have hospice at some point before dying versus those who never do actually live on average 29 days longer. But that benefit, reaping that benefit from hospice care is really difficult if you wait until those last weeks or days to participate in hospice care, that you're more likely to see that when you get involved with hospice care earlier in the process. More importantly, because we're focused on quality and not quantity, is that in addition to longevity, more longevity, that those patients had improved care, improved quality of care, coordination of care, and quality of life. And so that's also something that helps dispel that myth. Another myth is that hospice is expensive. Hospice is covered by Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance. So the patient and family are not going to be invoiced in any way for care. Now, a good hospice typically will spend more than they receive from Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance because you're going above and beyond their very minimum standards of care. But we have people like Kaylee, who's with me today, who work on donations and fundraising to help close that gap between the true cost of care for us and what we actually receive from the patient's insurance, so that we aren't billing patients and families for care. It's not just for people with cancer. I hear this one a lot. Hospice care is for any person with any diagnoses of any age. Because another myth is that it's only for older people, but we have infants, we have teenagers, we have middle-aged people. It's for anyone who is facing the last several months of life. And this one's my favorite one. This is a national myth. Locally, I've heard people call it the death shot, that what hospice does is come and administer a large dose of morphine. It's, again, if that were the case and if that's what we were supposed to be doing, we failed, because patients tend to live longer with hospice care than if they didn't have hospice care. So that dispels that myth on its own. But in addition to that, it's also true that the hospice team is only administering medicines your physician is writing orders for. We aren't, the nurse in the home is not a physician and can't write orders, so we can't administer any medicine that isn't approved by the patient's physician. So that's another important. I think all myths have a little tiny grain of truth in them, and what's the grain of truth in this one? When people come to hospice, they are at the end of life, and so hospice patients tend to die. And that's the grain of truth. But the hospice philosophy from the beginning in Great Britain is neither hasten nor postpone. Natural process, and you're there to make sure there's comfort, there's dignity, and there's compassion. National polls over and over again show that when you ask someone what they think hospice means, they say it means giving up. I'm not sure quite what to say about that because it's so contrary to what I see every day. Because other polls show again and again and again that when you ask Americans what they're most concerned about when they think about their last months of life, the answers are pretty much the same over and over again. I'm afraid of being in pain. I'm afraid of dying in a hospital connected to tubes and machines, and I'm afraid of burdening my family, either physically because of my care or financially because of the cost of care. Hospice was designed to address those fears. So to me, hospice gives you hope that those fears can be dealt with, that together we can work on those fears, and that the patient has more important work to do in the last chapter of life than to worry about pain, to worry about burdening their family, and to worry about where they will die. We try to return control of that chapter to the patient and family. And that's a hopeful thing to me. Another myth is only a physician can make a hospice referral. In fact, anyone can call and ask us at any time if we think, given certain facts about the loved one in question, if it may be time to talk about hospice care. More importantly, studies have shown that when they call this in the medical world self-referral, that if you call for yourself or a family member, you're more likely to have hospice longer than you would if you waited on a physician to tell you it was time for a referral, and have better outcomes in terms of quality of life, quality of care, and even according to the most recent big study, those 29 more days. So it's very important all throughout your life to be proactive about your health care, and it remains important when it's possible that the end of life is near, so that you have control over your care and that it reflects what's important to you. Okay, so now to the Unitarian Universalist Principles. When I look at your 7 principles, these jump out to me, these 3, having to do with the inherent worth and dignity of all, justice, equity, compassion, and human relations, free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And I thought I would talk briefly about each one before we go to our reading. I think worth and dignity, when I think about that particular principle, I think about a number of things related to hospice care, but the first is that I think hospice care is so focused on self-determination and autonomy, which are so key to worth and dignity of the person. And the idea that our care is truly based, our plan of care, everybody in healthcare is required to have a plan of care, is based on that particular patient's values, needs, and hopes. I think in that sense it promotes personhood and the humanness of each patient we serve. And I think also, I had a note about this that I've misplaced that I wanted to think about, that life and personhood and what it means to be human all still matter, even if you cannot be fixed medically. And all of us will reach that point in life when we cannot be fixed medically. We don't stop mattering as human beings with our own identities and wants and needs and hopes and fears because we can't be fixed. And your care needs to reflect that if it's to honor your inherent worth and dignity as a person. Truth and meaning and the freedom for that search. When I think about hospice care and that principle, the first thing that comes to mind is one of our goals as a team is to help this patient and family find meaning in this chapter of life. And the patient and the family are not free to do that on any level until the patient's physical needs are addressed. If pain and suffering are an issue, truth and meaning and searches for those things are not possible. And so we have to get pain and symptoms under control. We have to address the immediate needs and concerns and fears of that caregiver who is now going to be caring for that person at home, so that together as a group, a unit, they are free to have this search for truth and meaning, especially as it relates to this chapter of life. And then justice, equity, and compassion. I had an image that came to mind immediately as I thought about equity, and I thought about Joy Euphema. You can do a Google search on her later, but she was kind of a founder. She was a rabble-rouser from New England. She was a nurse who thought that the way we cared for the dying in the 70s was horrific. And she decided to do something about it, caused quite a stir, and she's credited with being one of the American founders of the hospice movement. She came to us in 1981 when these women from EKU went to hear Dame Cecily Saunders, came back determined to found a hospice, and they said, let's bring Joy Euphema here to talk to our community about what hospice means and why it's important. We brought her back again when we celebrated our 30th anniversary in 2011. And she made our staff do an exercise. We had to stand on a chair. One of us stood on a chair and the other sat in a chair. And they faced each other. The person standing on the chair had to tell the person sitting in a chair that they were facing death. And she used that exercise to preach to us the importance of being with people on this journey, not over or above them. So our nurses, our staff, our team, our social workers, they're trained to get on eye level every visit, every time. If a patient is in a bed, you sit on the edge of the bed or you sit in a chair by the bed. We don't hover over. It's a really simple detail, but it speaks volumes about what we're trying to do in terms of being equal with this patient and family. We aren't the professionals who know better. We're with you on this journey. You know things that we don't know. We're going to learn it together. We're going to do it together. And then compassion. None of this other stuff is possible. You can't focus on inherent worth and dignity or enabling someone's search for truth and meaning if you don't have the compassion necessary to believe those things matter and are important. And so that is something we always address and are working on in our training and our education with our staff, and as we speak and talk to each other about our daily challenges to that value. So, here we are. I brought a reading, so 3 paragraphs or 3 little sections from a book I highly recommend called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters at the End. Has anyone heard of it? Good, good, good. It's also a Frontline documentary, so you can stream it online anytime at pbs.com, and I recommend that too. But the book is wonderful, written by a physician named Atul Gawande, who has a lot to say about the challenges inherent in our current healthcare system, and I would like to have a first volunteer to read the first little reading. Anybody? Who's your good readers? There's one. Okay. And then you'll pass it to the next volunteer. There are 3. Who's the first one? Yes, sir.
The problem with medicine and the institutions it has spawned for the care of the sick and the old is not that they have had an incorrect view of what makes life significant. The problem is that they have had almost no view at all. Medicine's focus is narrow. Medical professionals concentrate on repair of health, not sustenance of the soul. Yet, and this is a painful paradox, we have decided that they should be the ones who largely define how we live in our waning days. For more than half a century now, we have treated the trials of sickness, aging, and mortality as medical concerns. It's been an experiment in social engineering, putting our fates in the hands of people valued more for their technical prowess than for their understanding of human needs.
Thank you.
He didn't finish reading all of this. So I'm going to finish. That experiment has failed. If safety and protection were all we sought in life, perhaps we could conclude differently. But because we seek a life of worth and purpose and yet are routinely denied the conditions that might make this possible, there's no other way to see what modern society has done. All we ask is to be allowed to remain the writers of our own story. That story is ever changing. Over the course of our lives, we may encounter unimaginable difficulties. Our concerns and desires may shift, but whatever happens, we want to retain the freedom to shape our lives in ways consistent with our character and loyalties. This is why the betrayals of our body and mind that threaten to erase our character and memory remain among our most awful tortures. The battle of being mortal is the battle to maintain the integrity of one's life, to avoid becoming so diminished or dissipated or subjugated that who you are becomes disconnected from who you were or who you want to be. Sickness and old age make the struggle hard enough. The professionals and institutions we turn to should not make it worse.
And last one.
Technological society has forgotten what scholars call the dying role and its importance to people as life approaches its end. People want to share memories, pass on wisdoms and keepsakes, settle relationships, establish their legacies, make peace with God, and ensure that those who are left behind will be okay. They want to end their stories on their own terms. This role is, observers argue, among life's most important for both the dying and those left behind. And if it is, the way we deny people this role out of obtuseness and neglect is cause for everlasting shame. Over and over, we in medicine inflict deep gouges at the end of people's lives and then stand oblivious to the harm done.
Thank you for helping with those readings. I have a last one from the same book. We've been wrong about our job in medicine. We think our job is to ensure health and survival, but really it's larger than that. It's to enable well-being. And well-being is about the reasons one wishes to be alive. Those reasons matter not just at the end of life or when debility comes, but all along the way. Whenever serious illness or injury strikes and your body or your mind break down, the vital questions are the same. What is your understanding of the situation and its potential outcomes? What are your fears and what are your hopes? What are the trade-offs you're willing to make and not willing to make? And what is the course of action that best serves this understanding? The field of palliative care emerged over recent decades to bring this kind of thinking to the care of dying patients, and the specialty is advancing, bringing the same approach to other seriously ill patients, whether dying or not. This is cause for encouragement, but it is not cause for celebration. That will be warranted only when all clinicians apply such thinking to every person they touch. No separate specialty required. If to be human is to be limited, then the role of caring professions and institutions, from surgeons to nursing homes, ought to be aiding people in their struggle with those limits. Sometimes we can offer a cure, sometimes a salve, sometimes not even that. But whatever we can offer, our interventions and the risks and sacrifices they entail are justified only if they serve the larger aims of a person's life. When we forget that, the suffering we inflict can be barbaric. When we remember it, the good we can do can be breathtaking. So, the hospice movement started in this country because many felt there was great suffering for the dying and that we could do so much better. They saw that the general wish of people at the end of life wasn't honored, to be home, to be their person, themselves, who they are, to continue being that person, not to be in pain, not to be a burden. And we were causing harm instead of helping. in denying personhood and in denying what it means to be human and in treating diseases rather than people. Hospice really was created as an alternative to that. And so now what I'll do is share a story that kind of demonstrates that alternative. And I'm going to find a picture for you. Nancy was a patient of ours in our home program. We were caring for Nancy, middle-aged, was a nurse before she retired, so she was well aware of what her lung cancer prognosis meant. When she was diagnosed, her first thought went to her youngest grandson, Deacon, who was a young toddler at that time, because Nancy's legacy was that she loved to be she was famous in her family for making the first day of school, that first day of school for her kids, a big deal. She was the mom who went out to the bus stop. She had their new lunchbox, their new backpack. They're dressed in nice clothes, and she stayed on the curb as the bus pulled away and waved the entire time. My mom was one of the moms who admittedly ran back inside as soon as we got on the bus and jumped over the kitchen table long ways, was how she put it, in celebration because she'd been with us all summer. So, but Nancy wasn't that mother. She waved until the bus went away, and that was just a big deal for her. Her family told us that, for some people it's Christmas, for some it's Thanksgiving. For her, it was that first day of school, represented change and transitions, and that was huge for her. When she came to our Compassionate Care Center, much later, after having cared for her for several months, she was actively dying. The reason she came to the center was because she had developed more pain. And you can come to the center if there's a symptom we're having trouble controlling at home. We can offer inpatient care at the center. So her family said, she's not very verbal right now, but there's a lot of moaning and groaning and bed picking and other signs that she's in pain. And our nurses assessed her and found that her vital signs suggested there was pain. So we brought her to the center and worked right away to get her pain under control. Now her vitals and everything the nurses and the doctors assessed to determine if pain is present in someone who's nonverbal found that she was no longer in pain. Her respirations were normal, her heart rate was normal, but she continued to pick at the bed linens and to moan and to seem miserable. So the staff worked with her family very closely for a couple of days to try to learn more about what was going on here. And it was her best friend who finally said, since day one, what she has been worried about is whether she would be here for Deacon's first day of school. He was 2, 3 maybe at the time. And the best friend said, she's talked about this all along. She really wanted to be here for Deacon's first day of school, and I think she knows she's not. That the end is near now, and that's not a possibility anymore. And it's causing her pain, not the kind of pain you can fix with medicine. So our team said, well, she needs to see him go to school. That's what we need to make sure happens. So our team called Madison County Schools, and we're famous in town for these odd requests, so if you ever get one, just be patient with us. But we said, we know it's July, but can you send us a school bus and a school bus driver, because we have a 3-year-old here who needs to go off to the first day of school. So the team worked with their plan of care, was redeveloped to reflect what we believed at that time Nancy needed. They adjusted all of her medicines so that they could keep the pain under control, but bring Nancy back so that she could speak, see what's happening, be cognitively aware of what's going on with her. Their whole plan worked around that idea. We were able to do that, but still keep her comfortable. That was the concern, was how to pull back some on the pain medicine, but make sure Nancy was present in this moment. And we got there. So when the time came, the nurse rolled Nancy out and into the front of the Compassionate Care Center. And the school bus, where's my picture? The school bus pulled up, and they went all out for us. The arms went out on the bus, the lights were flashing, and they stopped. And Deacon went up and said, "Goodbye, Nana," and he got into the bus. And the bus pulled away, and she waved. And we hadn't really thought through that part, so they took him to Lowe's. We weren't sure exactly what. So it was poor planning on our, but he was okay. But he rode around the Lowe's parking lot for a while. But Nancy turned to everyone and said, "I am so happy I got to see that." Those were the last words she spoke. She died 4 hours later. She was not moaning. She wasn't picking at bed linens anymore. Nancy's source of pain, someone has to find out what is meaningful to you. Someone has to make sure that that's still at the heart of your care. Even if you can't be fixed, those things still matter. And that is what brought her quality of life and peace and meaning and truth at the end of her life. Another story, Deacon, by the way, does a lemonade stand for us every year. He's an amazing kid. And he's been on radio shows with us to talk about his grandmother, and just a wonderful story altogether. Then the second and last story I'll share with you is a video story, if it all pops up here correctly, and it seems not to be. Figure out where that is. Wonder why I can see the video on my screen, but not on the projector. Oh, that's too bad. Well, you know what I'll do is I'll turn it around. I'm sorry, I know many of you won't be able to see that. Maybe it thinks there's two screens. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I can toggle the F something. What is that one?
F and Windows, the Windows button.
There we go. Very good.
Teamwork.
Yeah. So, now let's see if it's going. There we go. So Marlene's story was another example of having the time. Marlene was referred with many months left in her life, and so we had time to learn about her, to talk with her, to she had pancreatic cancer, and that's brings with it considerable pain, especially when it's metastatic, and it was. So the immediate concern is to get pain and symptoms under control, and then the team gets to know her, understand what's important to her, and they noticed that whenever she talked about the bells, that she just lit up. It was something that brought her just great joy, and began to work with the family on how can we make that happen for her again. And it took, it was 2 to 3 weeks of care, pretty intense care. We had to do some labs, we had to do other things to get her to a point where she could have the energy to do this, have her pain controlled, but be able to play music and read a hymn book in front of her, which took a lot of work. So I think what I hope is that what you get today from this visit is, and our time together, is that in many ways, although hospice care has been, part of medical care now for 3 or 4 decades, it's still pretty radical stuff. It was a radical idea that it is critical and, in fact, contributes to quality of life and quality of care to continue to acknowledge the inherent worth and dignity of each person, to understand what brings meaning to them in their lives, and that it matters what those things are, even when we can't fix them. To give people their autonomy back, have them at home, have them comfortable, and then learn what they need to alleviate pain and suffering, physical and otherwise, and complete this chapter on terms that matter to them. And we, as I said before, so appreciate your support. Just quickly, when Medicare reimburses us, they assume we visit a patient once every 2 weeks. We get a flat rate per day for a patient's care, but that rate assumes our nurse goes once every 2 weeks. The nurse was with Marlene every day for 3 weeks, So we're not being paid for that care. That's why the fundraising that Kaylee and her team does is just so critical, and the support that you've given our hospice are so critical to our mission. And we're very dedicated to continuing working the way we do, regardless of what new challenges the future may bring in healthcare or with the changing marketplace in terms of for-profit hospices in the state. So thank you so much for your help. And if I can answer any questions for you at this time, I'd be happy to. Yes. You mean how many people? Sure. So, in Richmond, yes. And I'll go back to your first question. It changes day to day. In the hospice world, just like the hospital world, we refer to a patient census. How many patients are we serving this day? And so one day it might be 85, another day it might be 92. So I guess if you want a true number, I could give you a monthly average, and it might be 85, something like that. About 85 patients each day in 6 counties, and an average of about 9 patients each day at our Compassionate Care Center in Richmond. And then as to the founding, yes, it started right here in Richmond by the women I mentioned earlier, one of whom was Mary Lou Witt, who was with MEPCO, ran home health for many, many years. She was one of our founders. I'm forgetting the name of the one I adore so much, who used to teach the death and grief class at EKU. MMM. Say it again? Marita Thompson. Thank you. I don't know why that escaped me. Marita was one of them. Janet Brandenburg was another. So it started in Richmond, really all volunteer organization for many years. That was in 1981. The Medicare-Medicaid hospice benefit wasn't legislated until 1985, so they worked solely on donations for those first several years. Yes, ma'am.
What does the for-profit hospice look like?
Well, you will understand you're going to get a biased answer from me. All hospices are reimbursed the same, okay? So Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance negotiate a rate, and it's the same for all hospices. Approximately $140 a day for a home patient. With that amount of money, you have to provide for all physician, nursing, social work, nurse aid visits that will happen. You have to provide for every single medication the patients take, and most of our patients are over 65 and take many, many medications, some of which are very expensive. So we cover all the medications. Every piece of medical equipment, beds, suction machines, oxygen, bedside tables, every supply, gauze, the chucks that you put on a bed to help keep things dry. So we have to provide any therapies, any inpatient care, all of that has to come out of that per diem. So for a nonprofit hospice whose mission is more than bottom line oriented, you fundraise like crazy to try to make sure you have enough to cover the difference between what you're going to receive from Medicare, Medicaid insurance and what the true cost of care is. A for-profit hospice has to figure out how do you maximize profit from that per diem. And so what you'll find often is that Medicare law requires that if you call yourself a hospice, you have to provide nursing, social work, and chaplain services. But a for-profit hospice may have 150 patients per social worker, and we have 35. That kind of thing. So you're going to find, my father's a good example. He lived in North Georgia, had hospice care for his mother-in-law, and didn't know and didn't talk to me about these differences. And he had a terrible hospice experience, and I had to work with him a lot to get him not to feel badly about where I worked, because I had to try to explain this is a different animal you've seen. It's not what I do. But it was, you're going to only send that nurse every 2 weeks because you're not getting paid to send the nurse anymore. And if you send the nurse more than that, it's really hard to get a profit out of that per diem. The largest hospice in the country is owned by the same company that owns Roto-Rooters. I mean, I don't know what else to say than that, but it's that is not to say that there aren't some for-profit hospices out there who have good practices and the same commitment to good quality of care. Yeah.
We had, when my mother was in hospice in college, we had to pay until she was in the active stage of dying, and she was there for 2 months. And so, fortunately, she had the funds, you know, and the care there was very good, but not at the level of what I experienced as a volunteer at hospice here. And by the way, there's training for people who want to be volunteers on
September 30th, we are having a new volunteer training. So if you ever feel moved or motivated to support hospice care in some way, that's an excellent way. We're always looking for help with volunteers, both in the home program and at the Compassionate Care Center. And if you'd wish to make a donation, I appreciate the support you made today. You already have. But if in the future that's on your mind, Kaylee is an excellent resource and can talk with you about donations. Yes. 2 of you. Sorry. Go ahead, in the back.
If there's a problem with this congregation, it's that we're too generous.
That's...
You see the wagon, and we do that. When I made a request that we collect for the women's shelter, we did that. We've done backpacks for children in school. After your loved one has passed, there's all that equipment that you've got left. Do you accept that?
We do. We do. We have the durable medical equipment space in Berea where we accept donations. We clean the equipment, sterilize the equipment, and if it's in good working order, we can use that with patients and families. So yes, we do. And if you have that kind of equipment, from wheelchairs to hospital beds to bariatric mattresses is a common need, believe it or not, that would be wonderful. And that just call our office. You have our phone numbers in the bag of information I've given you, and you can call and say, I'd like to donate some medical equipment. And unopened medical supplies like gloves or chucks or briefs are something people also find left behind, and we accept the unopened ones as well. That's a good point. It's funded exactly the way hospice home care is. There are 3 types of care we can offer at the center from insurance companies' perspectives, and they're the payer source. So there's general inpatient care, there is respite care, and there is home care. And I'll explain that in a second. So if we can demonstrate that the patient is there because they have a symptom we can't manage at home, we've attempted to and can't, then we get reimbursed at a higher rate by Medicare because we've demonstrated to them that inpatient care is warranted and necessary. And so they pay us a slightly higher amount to help cover the cost of having nurses and physicians on staff 24/7. If it's respite care, it's the government and insurance companies consider it not as expensive because nursing care is not as critical. So they reimburse us at a lower rate for respite care. That's when a patient comes because the caregiver needs to recharge batteries for up to 5 days so that the caregiving can continue at home. So we care for the patient in the inpatient setting for 5 days to give the caregiver a break. And then if we have a patient, and this has happened many times, I could tell you so many stories from a sex offender who no one would take. He was a sex offender. Karen could probably tell you some stories too. Who had psychiatric issues, but there was no psychiatric facility that would accept an end-of-life psychiatric patient, and nowhere else for him to go. So we had to care for him for a couple of months. Because no one else would accept him. We can't demonstrate. We managed the symptom in the first couple of days, so we could not bill for inpatient care. He wasn't there for respite, so we can't bill insurance for respite care. So we treated him as a home patient and could only request home patient reimbursement from Medicare, which is that low $149 or whatever a day. So over the course of the few months he was there, we absorbed many thousands of dollars in care because who else would take the gentleman? I mean, there was no one else to take him and care for him, and if inherent worth and dignity is there for all, it's there for all. Same with a veteran who was dying and had the only benefits available to him was a benefit that would allow him to go to a veteran-run nursing home that had no beds open. So we kept him at our facility for a long time as well, but again had to absorb the cost of that. Other facilities would not do that maybe. It's not smart business practice on any level, but I think we do what our mission calls us to do and just have great faith that everything will fall in place the way it needs to in order for us to continue our work. Yes. Hmm.
So she didn't make it to hospice, but I requested donations to hospice,
Hmm.
in her obituary.
Hmm.
There was some substantial
Oh, that's wonderful.
and so it's something that those people got well considered.
Thank you. That was kind of you, and that's a good point. We're blessed that a lot of people who do have hospice care choose to do that and request that donations be made to hospice in lieu of flowers. But that's a wonderful point that even without having had hospice care, you can choose to do that. And thank you for doing that. Yes.
I guess I'm one that's had all the services we've had. And sometimes we talk about how backward Kentucky is in so many things. Yeah, this wonderful thing happened here. And also, the day before Bob died, a lot of you were out in hospice in his room. So
Thank you for that. The inpatient facility was opened in 2008, and it was, I think, when it was being constructed, would have been the second one in Kentucky. There was one being constructed just ahead of ours in Ashland. Sadly, most hospices now are not opening those anymore because they have found, as we have found, it's very, very difficult to keep it afloat financially. It's a very expensive facility to operate. But again, we're very committed, and we have a wonderful group of people who work with fundraising all the time so that we can keep that there, because that's the kind of feedback we've heard, is that it feels like something very special, and the community seems to want it there. Karen, did you have another question? I know you had your hand up a time or two.
Oh, I just wanted to say that there are many ways to volunteer, and there are times when there are mailings that need to go out. We need extra people to just come in for a day. We have a new therapy dog, Joy, and if you really just want to come and come for a few hours, one day a week,
Mm-hmm.
And she needs to be walked outside and,
Right.
and, you know, given some attention that the nurses and other volunteers don't always have the time to give. So
Right.
that, you know, there's just a wide variety of different
Right.
roles.
Regardless of how much time you have, we can find something for you. Some have more time than others. And regardless of whether you feel comfortable working directly with patients and families or not, some people want to help, but they don't feel ready for that level of interaction yet. So either way, there's something that you can do to be helpful. Gardening would be a great help. Yes.
The first time I heard of hospice was actually 77.
Mm.
Came out to our house when my mother
Really?
saved our life.
Really?
Married her 15
Yeah. Living Good. Carlene Living Good? Or Arlene? Carlene Living Good, I think is who you're talking about. Could be. Colleen. Oh, that's a different Colleen. Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Really? In Richmond? Madison County. They were operating for a little bit before they were formally with the state as an organization in 1981. So that's what you're talking about, I think. Carlene Living Good would tell stories about going out to some homes on horseback in rural parts of the county. She has great stories to tell. Any other? Oh, well, thank you so much again for having us. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.